international network of higher education institutions. So we are currently, so we have member institutions. Currently, we have 600 member institutions located in over 40 countries. In some countries, including Canada, the SAR member institutions are organized into sections, and that's to better coordinate support for scholars and advocacy around scholars at risk. And so on the map right now, you can see that we have the SAR sections in 17 countries and regions currently. And then kind of at the top level, we have 2 offices with staff who work specifically for scholars at risk, the organization, such as myself. And those are our larger offices in New York. And then we have a smaller office located in Maynooth, Ireland, that does primarily European advocacy and then also works on some of our European programs. So our work is primarily in 3 areas. Our protection work, I think, is the most well-known. I will talk about it, but I'll spend a little bit less time on it because my guess is that people in the room know a bit more about that. And then we also have work in the area of learning and then work in the area of advocacy. And my own work sort of bridges learning and advocacy. So that is also what I can speak to best. So our protection work, there's a delay in the, so we typically seek to support about 300 scholars on an annual basis. That includes the people who we accept into the program and also people who we are actually able to arrange positions for. So for example, in 2024, we were able to arrange 164 positions for scholars to relocate from places where they were at risk. Oops, sorry. The way that our model operates is scholars apply to be accepted to the program. We evaluate their situation. That is based on a variety of criteria. It's based partially on risk level, but it's also based on, and this is, I think, where Gulai's points about the kind of the ways in which scholar programs may reinforce existing privileges within academia are quite relevant. So things like language are taken into consideration. We also, a big factor in our evaluation is whether or not we think we're going to be able to place the scholar. And that, again, has to do with language. It also has to do with disciplines. Some disciplines are easier to place than others. And it has to do with where kind of what institutions within the network we think have places available for the scholars. So there are many scholars who are at significant risk who we are unable to accept into the program. And that's partially also, we don't want to give scholars false hope. We don't want to accept them for placement if we don't think we're going to be able to place them. So once a scholar is accepted, we try to find them a position and connect them with a host organization. That typically can take a while, and some scholars we do accept and we are ultimately unable to place. And then kind of recognizing, again, what Gulai raised, which is the precarity that scholars who leave their home country and work in another location where they may not have a network, they may not know the culture as well. They are often, I think there's often a challenge with I think there's a stigma that can sometimes be associated with scholars at risk where they're seen among peers within their host institutions as charity cases, which I think we want to try to discourage. So while scholars are in their positions, we seek to give them advice, and we'll give them advice on working in the country that they're working in. We'll give them advice on how to relocate and establish themselves, and then also ultimately transitioning from SAR to longer term. So the ideal, I think in an ideal world, we would be supporting scholars who are at risk with these placements are typically 1 to 2 years. In an ideal world, they would be able to go back home. We know that that's usually, I would say, more often than not the case. So we also seek to support them to transition to longer term opportunities. So I'll end there with the protection work and move on briefly to our learning work. So we have actually a pretty a diverse learning agenda, which includes just webinars and virtual conferences. We also have a MOOC on academic freedom. I think one of the things we're always talking about internally is not just that academic freedom. There are debates on what academic freedom is, but that people don't. Many people don't know what academic freedom is. And I think, was it one of the presentations yesterday raised this point that people within the academy, scholars themselves, can't always define what academic freedom is. So we do have a MOOC that offers a course on what academic freedom is. We collaborate with global partners. So for example, we were involved in helping develop the indicators that are now part of the Academic Freedom Index, which we heard about yesterday. And then we facilitate speaker series. So we facilitate institutions to host SAR scholars to speak at their institutions, both about their research and then also maybe about their experience as scholars at risk. And then we also have a podcast series, which I would encourage everyone to subscribe to. I will just highlight a few things within our learning work that I think are useful. So we have what we call our values guide on higher education values that looks specifically at how academic freedom intersects with other values. So I think often, again, going back to the idea that the boundaries of academic freedom are a little murky, often when we talk about academic freedom, what academic freedom is ends up being kind of the boundaries between it and things like institutional autonomy. Is institutional autonomy part of academic freedom, or is it what we would argue probably is a facilitating condition for academic freedom? How do you balance things like academic freedom and equitable access to higher education? How do you balance academic freedom and then the social responsibility that universities have to society? So we have this values guide that looks at the intersection between these different higher education values and also provides a framework for evaluating incidents in relation to these values. We have a set of fellowships that we offer every year for researchers who are doing work on academic freedom. This is a small grant that we provide to support their research, and then we also facilitate, this is one of the projects that I work on, a set of workshops that are sort of like writing research development workshops over the course of about 8 months. We currently have a cohort of 10 fellows, and you can see them on their screen. They're doing really interesting work that ranges from, I would say, like the underlying theme of a lot of the current projects relate to self-censorship and academic freedom. So looking forward to seeing what they produce. And then our advocacy work. So the basis for our advocacy work is our monitoring work. I'm going to actually save that for last, just because what I would like to do is conclude with some kind of current reflections on the current moment, and I think talking about our advocacy work flows well into that. But I will highlight a few projects that we have. So we have our Scholars in Prison project. This is a project where we take on a much smaller number of cases of scholars who've been imprisoned specifically for their research. We have about 9 or 10 cases currently that we are advocating for. Some of them have been imprisoned for a very long time. And then we have a few cases that we're kind of currently considering taking on and doing more extensive advocacy for, including 2 scholars who were arrested last year in Azerbaijan and are still imprisoned. And then also perhaps there's a case of a US academic who was arrested for insulting the monarchy in Thailand just, I think, 2 weeks ago. We will work with partners to highlight their cases, write letters to governments, that sort of thing, to try to advocate for better conditions for their imprisonment and also ultimately, ideally, for their release. And I think a key aspect of this project is just making sure that these scholars, especially when they have been imprisoned for a decade or so or more, are not forgotten. We have a series of student advocacy seminars, so this goes close in hand with our Scholars at Prison project. So member institutions, if there is a faculty member who is motivated, can decide to work with Scholars at Risk to create a class for students where they can learn about academic freedom, and then also specifically develop research and advocacy for scholars in prison cases. And then in the U.S., for example, the student advocacy seminars culminate in what we call our student advocacy days, where all of the classes go to Washington, D.C. They have a day of conferences, and then they engage in meetings on Capitol Hill with Congress people so we'll try to get Congress people to take on the cases of scholars in prison. We have a series of academic freedom legal clinics. This, I would say, is very similar to our student advocacy seminars, where we work with member institutions, law schools, and to develop law clinics. Usually, these are oriented towards taking monitoring data, combining it with other data, and putting it into things like submissions to the Universal Periodic Review. That's the type of thing that the academic freedom legal clinics often do. This I'm going to pause on and spend a little bit more time talking about this initiative, which is the Principles for Implementing the Right to Academic Freedom. So this is a set of principles. So what we did was, starting in 2021, we worked with a variety of other organizations to convene an international working group to develop a set of principles on the right to academic freedom. So I'll underscore here that we talk about academic freedom as a human right. That is SAR's framework for academic freedom. And I will also just kind of in raising that, just say that I appreciate Gulai's discussion of academic freedom in context. I think we as an organization have developed a framework for understanding academic freedom in this ideal sense, which I think is useful for advocacy, but certainly is not universally lived. Yes, yes. So in March 2024, we published the final version of the principles, and this on the screen is the principles as a whole. I'm not going to read all of them, but I will highlight a few aspects of the principles that I think are unique. So as I said before, we view academic freedom as a human right. That, I would say, allows us to take a little bit broader understanding of academic freedom. So if you go to our next slide, we have in the principles that students have the right to academic freedom, which is, I would say, not universally accepted, although I think there are interesting things we can talk about I won't go. I have a whole monologue I could go on to about student protest and the right to academic freedom, but which I will save for the Q&A if anybody is interested. And then we also see academic freedom as essential to all levels of education. And I think that these two things directly stem from our understanding of academic freedom as a human right, because human rights are supposed to be universally applicable. And then I'll flag that we have the principles themselves describe in detail what each of the principles is. But then I think in some ways the most useful part of the principles are the two annexes that we have in it, which are, first of all, a guide that assesses how well academic freedom is implemented in a particular context, and then also a set of practical guidance on implementing the right to academic freedom. And it has a super detailed list of like questions that you can ask in order to evaluate academic freedom in a particular context, which I think could also be a really interesting guidance for a research project on academic freedom. Okay, so I'll take my last few minutes to just talk about the projects that I primarily work on, which are, first of all, our Academic Freedom Monitoring Project and our Free to Think report. So we track attacks on higher education. This project came out of, basically, the genesis of it was we were looking for more funding to support our Scholars at Risk work, and funders wanted to know, needed more evidence that this was actually a problem that they should be investing in, and that was sort of the genesis of the Academic Freedom Monitoring Project. I think at this point we have established pretty well that scholars are indeed at risk, and we're working, for example, on increasing the degree to which we can analyze the data within our monitoring project. This is what we do is we then take the data that we've collected over a year's time and we produce an annual report called Free to Think. This is an example of Free to Think 2024, looked at 391 incidents of attacks on higher education communities. I will say that number is interesting to look at, but doesn't actually tell you that much about what's going on. It is our analysis is more of a qualitative thematic analysis, where we seek to capture a wide variety of attacks that happen in a wide variety of contexts in order to paint a picture of what is going on in those contexts. So that is, highly affected by things like reporting, how good the reporting is in a particular context, what is our team capacity, and things like that. Some of the trends that we noted in last year's Free to Think was the erosion of norms in democratic countries, which we've been talking about a lot throughout this, the last day and a half. Related to that, threats to university autonomy. So we've seen a really kind of even across all contexts, regardless of whether they are liberal or illiberal, democratic or undemocratic, we've seen increasing threats to university autonomy. In some cases, this might look like in Nicaragua, the government has essentially fully eliminated the autonomy of the higher education system. In the United States, this is the autonomy, one of the main thing, I would say, like the thing that underpins pretty much all of the what's going on right now are efforts by the US government and federal government and state government to undermine university autonomy. And then the seizure of power by democratically elected authoritarians is related to this. These are the types of attacks that we look at. So we look at the targeted violence against academics. That includes threats. It includes, physical attacks. A big aspect of that category is violence against student protesters. Makes up a really significant portion of that category. We look at the imprisonment of students and academics, as well as prosecution. We look at loss of position, and loss of position really, I would say, is more, it might be a little bit more accurate to call that disciplinary action. So we include in that category anything from students being suspended, scholars being suspended or losing their positions, to we've included in that category the loss of status by student groups, for example. We have a category on travel restrictions. So and I think this goes back to what you were mentioning about the freedom of the intersection between academic freedom and freedom of movement, freedom of information, and the idea that academics need to be able to travel to conferences abroad, they need to be able to travel to do research. So we include violations related to travel, and that's also, we're including in that category the revocation of and detainment of students in the United States, international students in the United States. And then we have an other category which is increasingly full. It's expanded in recent years, and we include in that category legislative action and policy that undermines university autonomy, for example, as well as, for example, the cancellation of events, which we've tracked a lot in recent years, particularly related to expression on Palestine. I will just, I think what I'm going to do for the sake of time is I had some example cases, so I will flip through them and you can scan them really recently, but I did want to end on the United States. So Scholars at Risk, our headquarters is in the United States, and we have not historically done a lot of work in the United States, but our attention is increasingly focused on the United States. And so what we are seeing now in the United States and particularly concerned about is I think has been raised over the past couple of days, so I won't go into it in great detail, but I will highlight that states are continuing to pass laws undermining academic freedom, particularly targeting diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that seems to be increasing in recent months, kind of emboldened by the current environment. So just since the beginning of March, laws have passed in Ohio, Kentucky, and Idaho. In Idaho, the bill was introduced and then passed within a span of 9 days. And I think that time frame is useful to highlight because it shows how emboldened people are and how much they're just able to push things through at the moment. The one thing that we've tracked a lot, I think it's important to note that when we are seeing cases of loss of position, cancellation of events, that the intersection between decisions that universities are making and external pressure. And that external pressure is from elected officials. So elected officials tweeting something about a scholar or about an event, and that raising this, massive campaign to silence that academic. For example, it's donors, it's community members. I mean, I've heard cases of, universities will receive thousands of emails about a particular event and ultimately end up canceling it. So I think that it's important to look at the intersection of the decisions that universities are making and the kinds of pressure that they are receiving. We've in the last couple of years, this has died down a lot now, but violations related to on-campus protests regarding the war in Gaza, and then more recently, we've seen an expansion of executive action. So whereas prior to the current U.S. administration, most of what we saw taking place was at the state level, we now see this intensification at the executive level targeting universities, and that is, we can see that in what's been happening with Columbia and Harvard. And then, of course, the revocation of student visas and detentions of international scholars and students. I am on my last slide, and I will wrap up. I apologize. So just a couple really quick reflections on the current moment. So our model, our basic model at Scholars at Risk involves supporting scholars from countries where their lives and liberty are at risk in illiberal countries and moving them to liberal countries. And that model, I think, is increasingly running into challenges, being questioned, called into question. And so given what's going on, and also given what's going on with detentions of international students and scholars, fewer scholars want to be coming to a country like the US for placements. We've also seen this sort of flip of the standard script, where we are seeing recently European institutions creating programs for US scholars to come there. And this expression of solidarity is really heartening and it's needed. And for the relatively small number of academics in particularly targeted disciplines who might have difficulty continuing their work under the current administration, the idea of invitations to work in Europe or elsewhere may be of interest. However, it's important to note that they're not refugees, and we shouldn't imply that the professional obstruction that they might be experiencing in the US is fully equal to the kinds of violence, imprisonment, and targeted persecution that are regularly experienced by scholars around the world. And so while we recognize the increased pressure that US-based academics are facing, we also see that US-based scholars generally are not experiencing the extreme levels of violence, physical coercion, like scholars in many other conflict-affected countries, for example, Ukraine, Syria, Sudan, or Gaza, or authoritarian regimes such as China, Russia, Iran, and Afghanistan. Although I will also say that the risk that scholars in the US face varies significantly. So, for example, international scholars in the United States are perhaps at more risk of something like detention. So you know, it's hard to make kind of universal statements. So I think what scholars at risk would argue is that while institutions are creating positions for US researchers, partially on the presumption, and I've seen this in media articles, that they are among the best in the world, they should consider procuring resources for other threatened scholars, regardless of their national origin, whose talents may also reasonably be put to Europe's comparative advantage. So I have on the screen a couple of actions that Scholars at Risk is currently taking to address the current moment, which includes a bi-monthly news bulletin, compiling US-focused media, public writings, events, and updates. That is also, we are inviting people we're trying to use that as a way to share information, so encouraging people to write to us about events, initiatives, things like that. The next one is going out tomorrow. And then we're going to be organizing US-focused Zoom calls and webinars starting this spring, and we'll be holding our US Section General Assembly in October as well. So I will conclude there, and my apologies for going a little over time.